Hello and welcome to the Arthur B. Morrow Institute for Peace and Justice at St. Paul's College at the University of Manitoba. My name is Jason Brennan, the manager of the Morrow Institute, and I welcome you all to today's lecture. My director, Dr. Stan Amalidis, sends his regrets for today. I will be your host. The University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Ininiwak, and Ininisuik, Bikoto Yate, and Dene, and on the national homeland of the Métis Nation, Red River Métis. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past. And we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Thank you for attending today. This is the second of 3 fall term brown bag lectures. Please visit our website to see descriptions and find registration links and recordings for future and past lectures. Today's lecture is taking place both online and in person. The lecture is being recorded for future broadcasts on the Morrow Institute YouTube channel. The lecture will include a 35 to 40-minute presentation followed by a question and answer session. During that question and answer sessions, online viewers are asked to type their questions in the Q&A box on the Zoom platform, and then I will read those questions aloud to our lecturer. It may be possible for me to turn on your microphones. I had trouble with that at our last lecture. If I'm able to do it, I will do that as well. So, it is my great pleasure to welcome our guest lecturer today. I've known Andrew for more than 10 years and been able to admire his work from afar. Dr. Andrew Woolford is Professor of Sociology and Criminology at the University of Manitoba, an emeritus member of the Royal Society of Canada College, and former president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars. He is author of This Benevolent Experiment, Indigenous Boarding Schools, Genocide and Redress in the United States and Canada, 2015, and Between Justice and Certainty, Treaty Making in British Columbia, 2005, as well as co-author of The Politics of Restorative Justice, 2019, and Informal Reckonings, Conflict Resolution and Mediation, Restorative Justice and Reparations, of 2005. He's the co-editor of Did You See Us? Reunion, Remembrance, and Reclamation at an Urban Indian Residential School, 2021, and co-editor of Canada Colonial Genocide, 2017, co-editor of The Idea of a Human Rights Museum, 2015, and co-editor of Colonial Genocide in Indigenous North America, 2014. I invite and welcome Dr. Woolford to the Brown Bag Lecture podium. Andrew.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you to the Morrow for hosting me. It's so nice to see you all here. I see a lot of people made the trek over from sociology, as well as some peace and conflict studies faces I recognize. And welcome to all of you who are online. Just going to wait till my title shows up here so I can make fun of my title.
Sorry about that, Andrew. We'll get you going.
And the reason I'll make fun of this title is it's way too long and promises way too much for a 30-minute lecture. So be prepared to be a little bit disappointed that something on this massive list of topics is not going to be fully covered today, or even covered at all. I'm prepared to skip one of my case studies if I need to, and it'll probably be the one that I've done the least amount of work on, so you'll be able to know which one I'm still trying to complete in my research by the end of this talk. So, genocide is, I think, quite obviously a human process, a human enterprise, a human undertaking. When Raphael Lemkin introduced the genocide terminology to the world, he did so because he felt there are laws that existed to protect individuals' lives, but nothing existed to protect the lives of groups. And he wanted both a concept that could work in a social scientific manner, but also in a legal fashion that would protect those collective lives. So I want to make it clear from the outset, and there's going to be quite a few statements I'll be making to try to explain what I'm not doing, but I do some borrowing from some literature that's sometimes referred to as post-humanist or new materialist, but this is not a post-humanist approach. I don't think such an approach is entirely fitting to genocide studies where humans are so central to the process of perpetrating, but also as the collective, as part of the groups. But what I do want to do today is add in more than human or non-human entities as part of the collective to try to show that the relationships that humans have with their natural world are quite important to their groupness, to their group identity. And I'm not going to be saying that destroying those relationships is in and of itself genocide. It's another qualification I'm going to make. But that it is a key consequence of genocidal processes, and one that has been understudied in my field, the very narrow and dismal field of genocide studies. So the 4 examples I'm going to draw on, but I've only promised you 3 so far, are the Armenian, Rwandan, Cambodian, and Canadian genocides. And I'm going to use them to illustrate how human and more than human relationships were impacted by genocidal processes, disrupting cultural patterns of family life and child socialization that are integral to the negotiation of group continuity. To examine these case studies, what our research team has done is we've focused predominantly on transcripts from survivors, that is oral history documents where survivors recall their experiences before, during, and after a genocidal event. But we also draw on works of art, such as poetry, and painting, and film, poetry, song, and other resources, as well as, of course, the secondary historical material on each of these case studies, to try to show the prominence of these more than human entities within the cultural life of these groups of people. And it was quite interesting as we looked at the testimonies from whether it was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada or the civil portion of the ECCC, the Extraordinary Chambers of the Courts of Cambodia. It wasn't hard to find reference to rice or to water. These things, keyword searches actually gave us more hits than we could possibly pursue in these areas. Okay, now let's... Now, one thing the next qualification I'm going to make is that this is not suggesting that there's a direct analogy or a sameness between the case study that involves Anishinaabe and Cree peoples in Manitoba and the 3 other case studies that are considered in this project. Each group has its own distinctive relationships, but certainly Indigenous relationships through the natural world are incredibly unique in terms of the liveliness and the spirited nature of the many more than human co-constituents who participate in group life in Indigenous communities. So certainly Indigenous perspectives have influenced my work because I've long worked on the topic of settler colonial genocides, trying to understand what's distinctive about genocidal experience in a place like Turtle Island in Canada and the United States. So what I'm trying to do here in this project is to instead sort of kind of flip the genocide framework. Because what's often happened in genocide studies is we start with a prototypical set of cases, the canonical cases of genocide. Cases like the Holocaust, which is the most prominent prototypical case. And what genocide scholars have done is they've created rubrics based upon these cases to try to understand where and when genocides are happening in other parts of the world. So instead, I want to start with a local case study with some of the distinctiveness of Indigenous experiences of genocide on Turtle Island, and then reach out with that framework to other cases, to canonical cases like the Armenian, Cambodian, and Rwandan genocides. Again, not to suggest that these are identical genocides or identical experiences, but I want to take influence from scholars like Nahia scholar Tasha Hubbard and her work on Buffalo genocide to see, well, does this have any resonance with other cases in other parts of the world? Now, I said this is not a post-humanist project, but I do make some small borrowings from that field of studies. Initially in this project, we did immerse ourselves quite a bit in post-humanist, new materialist literature. And I think, one of the most basic borrowings is in the form of a problematizing of the culture-nature binary. Now, this is not to say that I'm always going to provide a perfectly entangled sense of culture and nature. Sometimes there is an analytical utility to speaking about culture in order to communicate to an audience like yourselves. But this binary has had problem effects in the world of genocide studies, going back to the creation of the law of genocide, the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide itself. Because when Raphael Lemkin came to the United Nations, and he was actually part of the group who provided the initial draft of the Genocide Convention, he presented three primary techniques of genocide. Physical genocide, that is what we typically think of as genocide, mass murder. Biological genocide, which interrupts reproductive processes within a group. And cultural genocide that destroys the genius or the cultural life of a group, as he expressed it. Now, these were analytical distinctions he made about the types of genocide, but he really saw these as overlapping processes that were intertwined. But as his draft of the Genocide Convention went to other subcommittees of the United Nations, they made a decision to separate culture out from those other processes of genocide, to create a separate article on cultural genocide. And in doing that, they created the conditions where, when at the General Assembly, the colonial powers were more involved in negotiating the final terms of the Genocide Convention, they could more easily sponsor its removal from the Genocide Convention. So Article 3, that protected the cultural life of groups, was completely removed from the Genocide Convention. So in genocide law, we've lost much opportunity to think about the ways in which culture, physical life, the biological life of groups intersect. This literature has also been somewhat helpful for, although I think Indigenous studies has been more helpful, for making a move away from human-focused frameworks that are prominent in genocide studies that solely see genocide through a human lens. And I'll get to some summary of how genocide studies has typically reviewed the role of the natural world in genocide in a moment. But first I want to acknowledge my PhD students, Wanda June and Marvin Zia, who have been working on this project with me. Wanda is now a professor at Mount Royal University in Alberta, and Marvin is about to defend his dissertation on December 1st at 1:30 p.m., 335 Isbister, if you want to see his examination of particularly bovine genocides in Tibet, Rwanda, and Canada, looking at bison, cattle, and yaks. But we originally started with this language of symbiogenetic destruction to try to capture the ways in which genocide destroys this process whereby different entities become together, that their mutual existence adds to or enhances the life of the human group in some way. So we borrow this from Haraway, Donna Haraway, who herself borrowed it from the terminology from Beth Dempster, but we also were combining it with some work by Karen Barad on new materialism, looking at her notion of interaction, which presumes a baseline state of entanglement out of which separability, the differentiation of bits of matter, is performed. And just me reading that sentence maybe can give you a sense of why I've backed off from some of this literature. I've done too many presentations where presenters like Jason have had to introduce my work and they've stumbled over this word symbiogenetic, and then I immediately get to the front of the classroom and I also bungle the word and can't say it myself. So I moved more to this terminology, genocide with nature, even though maybe it doesn't as, it maybe does less to topple the culture and nature binary, but ultimately the goal here is to communicate these ideas. I would like the survivors who we've interviewed, the elders we've interviewed as part of this project, to be able to look at this book if they so choose for whatever reason. I would like, anyone to be able to pick up this book and be able to engage with it when and if it's ever finished. So that's part of the reason. The notion of genocide nature simply registers those techniques of destruction that enlist or interfere with co-constitutive relationships between humans and more than humans. So with that definition, I'm also trying to capture that, sometimes, the relationships are being destroyed within the current project is what we're focusing on, how those relationships with the natural world are destroyed. But in some cases, one might also look at the ways in which the natural world is enlisted to participate within the genocidal process by a perpetrator, the ways in which space could be used, for example, to destroy a group, just as Ottoman Turkish groups used the deserts in Syria to destroy Armenians as they marched them away from Turkish territory. So in short, a focus on genocide with nature seeks to sensitize genocide studies to the complex role of more than human entities in the groups we seek to protect. So the basic starting points of this project are, and we're 13 minutes in and I'm just getting to the starting points. The group is a concept that's at the core of genocide studies. That's what genocide is all about. Sometimes this is forgotten, but Lemkin's creation of the word was to protect groups. Group solidarity and bonds are built through culturally informed relationships. Therefore, I would argue that the removal of cultural genocide from genocide law has been very problematic. And part of these cultural bonds and cultural solidarity are the relationships we have with the more than human world, that we become groups with the more than human world. Now, families, childhoods obviously have a role to play in the ways in which we take up culture and learn about relating with the natural world. But another qualification I have to give is there's always a potential conservatism when we start talking about family, childhoods, and cultures as things we want to preserve. Because it can sound like we want to preserve these things under glass as reified, static categories. And that's not necessarily the perspective we're taking. We're understanding cultures and therefore families and childhoods as processes, as things that are negotiated, that are contentious topics within the groups themselves. So cultures change over time. Our approach to the family, our understanding of the family changes over time. Our understanding of childhood changes through these moments of contest, of appropriation, compromise, subversion, masking, invention, revival, all of these things that occur within the life of cultural groups. So what we're really talking about here is not the preservation of some notion of culture and family life and childhood that's preserved under glass, but rather looking at those moments where there's an abrupt and violent attempt to transform these institutions and the very real and dismal human consequences that often follow from these rapid forced changes. So, genocide studies to date has, I'm still on this slide, has grappled with children to the extent that it's considered children as both carriers of the biological and cultural life of the group. In genocide law, it's just their capacity as biological carriers of the group that really matters. Article 2E of the Genocide Convention, which references the forcible transfer of children of the group to another group, sounds like it's talking about preserving the children's capacity as cultural carriers of the group. But in most legal interpretations, the reading of that Article 2E is that this only refers to the biological and physical life of the group. That if you remove the children and they never can return to the group cannot reproduce itself as a biological entity. Lemkin obviously believed that the children's cultural carriers was important to preserve. But in both of these situations, we get this kind of bifurcation of children either as belonging to culture or belonging to nature. Or the sense that children belong to nature, they're wild until they are socialized, made part of the group through their cultural learning. And that doesn't quite get at the hybridity of childhood when you look at the examples in our case studies, the ways in which children, engaged in learning water teachings with their grandparents and learned a notion of reciprocity and responsibility in relation to that water. Or the ways in which they learned the boundaries of their world through reference to mountains as a guide. That it wasn't like a move from nature to socialization. Nature was always there as part of that socialization. Okay. So my focus is on how Armenians, Khmer Cambodians, Banya Rwanda, and Anishinaabe and Cree peoples constitute themselves in part out of their existing relationships with Mount Ararat, rice, cattle, and waters, respectively. These are not the only relationships out of which they make themselves, but they are nonetheless important relationships and ones that were particularly threatened by genocide in each. Now we get to this slide. I want to give you a little bit of a background on how genocide studies has typically dealt with the environment. In the earliest examples, we see genocide studies seeing the natural world as a point of contestation. This Nazi notion of blood and soil, that they had to purify the land of those impure elements so that the land that truly belongs to Germans could be made German. So land was seen as an object over which groups competed. Second way the natural world comes into genocide studies thinking is through this notion of dehumanization, whereby groups are often reduced to being like a non-human form, cockroaches, lice, nits, so on and so forth, beasts. They are not part of the humans and the human race, and therefore you don't owe the same responsibility. They're not part of the same universe of obligations, is how Klein put it. Third, natural world is viewed as a condition of life. This comes from the Genocide Convention itself, where if you create conditions of life in which the group is likely to suffer physical destruction, you are committing an act of genocide if you do so with intent. So land is there, plants are there, animals are there to serve an instrumental purpose of keeping us alive. More recently, scholars have started looking at ecological issues as an antecedent or cause of genocide, particularly in genocide prevention models and genocide risk models, where they look at the ways in which ecological destruction or the movement of climate refugees could cause conflict in a region. And finally, we have the work of people like Damien Short and Martin Cook, who talk about a genocide-ecocide nexus, the ways in which these processes of genocide and ecocide often overlap. Cambodia is a good example with this, where you have both the ecocide, the destruction of Cambodian farmland through American bombing, that creates the conditions out of which genocide arises. The two processes are strongly interrelated. So we're trying to situate our work more in relation to this last development, but to bring in a notion of how this physical overlap of ecocide and genocide combines or connects with cultural impacts. Okay. When I practiced this, I got to the case studies about 5 minutes later, so we're looking good. So I want to start with the case study that frames our analysis, and that is Anishinaabe and Cree relations with water. As I noted earlier, Indigenous relationships with the natural world are distinctive, and they're not treated here as identical to other groups' relationships with nature. But we want to focus on relationships with water, in part because as we started to look at the testimony from the TRC, it was quite impressive about how frequently water came up. But we also wanted to limit, because there is so much testimony available through the NCTR, limit our focus to Indigenous nations living around Lake Winnipeg. So we could also focus on a particular body of water. In Anishinaabe, water is referred to Nibi, but water is actually waters. There are a plurality of waters. So different bodies of waters have different spirit, different relationships of respect and reciprocity exist with those bodies of water. So this was also another way to try to focus our study a little bit to those communities around the lake. And in the testimony, they always begin by asking the survivor to recount what their life was like before residential schools. And it was very common for survivors to talk about learning lessons lakeside with their grandparents largely, but other community members and family members, providing these lessons that both communicated a respect for the lake and the dangers that come with the lake, but also the gifts that the lake gives, both the source of life and danger. So these childhoods with water, where they learned about being Anishinaabe, or Ininu, or Cree, that is, with water, were suddenly disrupted as they're thrust into the residential school. So they come from this world where they're learning to navigate by water. Language is tied up with waters. The whole geography of the place in which they live is connected to the waters around them. And women in particular have a role as water knowledge keepers, because like Mother Earth, who gives life through her waters, women as well give life through their waters, through the maternal waters. Water was part of ceremony. Elder Betty told us about listening to water and the voice of water, and how she was taught by her father to hear the drumbeat in the water. So water was really connected with the world, the cultural world. Their experience of water once they got to residential school, in that initial moment of being brought into the school, where one has their clothes taken and they are brought to be washed, scrubbed, sometimes with a delousing powder that was often quite caustic and irritating to the children. But then they would be scrubbed with this hot water, or sometimes very cold water. We remember the water being one of two ways. Water is used to communicate their profaneness, to communicate a sense of dirtiness. Water is also part of the punishments they received, whether, again, sometimes being exposed to hot or cold waters, being required to clean the school with waters. Frequently that was a common punishment, often using just a toothbrush and water. In those schools that had little detention cells where they would put the children sometimes, or closets they would lock them in. Sometimes they were restricted to no food, no water for a period, or just water. And water was the main site of sexual and physical violence within the schools, particularly around the shower rooms, where many recounted being abused, suffering their abuse at the hands of predators in these spaces. The school also sought to control their own waters. The tears, they were not allowed to cry often, instructed not to cry. Many survivors afterwards speak to Truth and Reconciliation Committee, talked about how it was hard to cry, or they had to learn to cry. And part of the ceremonies, the waters, and some of the healing ceremonies that took place afterwards tried to bring back those tears. But also controlling urination and when and where it was appropriate to go to the washroom or need to use the washroom. So in large, water was communicated as something you control, something that you can use as an instrument, as an object, something to be managed. Of course, there are also stories, and I won't get into it as much in this presentation, of how the young people used water to resist colonization within the schools and to resist assimilation, how they sought to return to waters, how they used waters as a path to escape from the schools. Or even Elder Rudy Olkama told us about how he felt playing hockey was a connection with the frozen waters and the freedom of flying around on the ice. But I'm going to move to the next case study still, which involves the Khmer Rouge. Now, Khmer Cambodians and many other indigenous groups within Cambodia have had a long relationship with rice. There's been about 2,000 years of cultivating rice within that region. Rice is an important element of family life. The family meal with rice is often rice is part of the meal 3 times a day where you sit together as a family. And even the word to eat in Khmer Cambodian translates literally to eat rice. Now many people living, rural Cambodians, Khmer Cambodians, also still practice or a worship of local spirits, the Nik Ta, the ancient ones as they're otherwise known, who are seen to reside in natural spaces, such as mountains, fields, mounds, or waters. And one has to maintain an important relationship with the Nik Ta and not disrespect the Nik Ta, so often bringing them offerings of food, so to ensure that there is a good harvest, to ensure the productivity of the crops, to try to prevent floods, drought, or sickness or other harms that might befall one's life. Now, relationships with rice were not static over this 2,000 years. It did start to change through exploitation, particularly at the hands of colonial powers. The French, in this instance, were seen as exploiting the Cambodian peasants, taking their rice, and not providing enough payment in return, and trying to force modernization upon Cambodia as well, the farms, prior to the rise of the Khmer Rouge. And then you add to that the American bombing of eastern rice paddies during the Vietnam War, and actually a lot of peasant farmers were motivated to join the Khmer Rouge, to be part of this revolution, originally to get out from under the yoke, the domination of the colonial powers. But the Khmer Rouge, in their vision of a new democratic Kampuchea society, had a problem presented to them, that they wanted to install year zero, to turn the clock back, and to try to erase all the influence of bourgeois capitalism, liberalism, and all these things that were seen as taking over the cities of Cambodian society, and try to set the clock back to implement a perfect communist society. And one of the things they did was they wanted to take away the money economy, take away Cambodian money, and so what they were left with was rice as a primary means of exchange. So the ways in which they would fund the revolution, the resources, the weapons and other things they needed to institutionalize their revolution, is that they traded rice. Rice became a key commodity. And they calculated to complete what they called the super great leap forward towards this idyllic society, was that they weren't going to be able to find the machinery necessary to increase rice production in order to trade it. So all they had was human power. So to then produce more rice and to meet the quota that they had installed of 3 tons per hectare, they saw it as necessary to reorganize society entirely. So 1975, beginning with the emptying of Phnom Penh and the movement of urban people into the countryside, creating a class of people or a caste of people called the New People, who were seen as less dedicated to the revolution than the old people, the base people, the people who had long worked the land. They were to be made into peasant farmers alongside the old people. And a division of labor was used to try to create efficiencies in rice production, creating mobile teams of young workers who would do some of the heavy lifting in the fields and in the irrigation work, as well as jobs for men, jobs for women, even jobs for children, jobs for pregnant women. Everyone had a role to play in rice production. Jobs for the elderly. So children would often gather dung from cattle for purposes of fertilization of the rice paddy. In order to implement this new division of labor, where often parents were not seeing their children for weeks, if not months at a time, because of these different groups to which they were assigned, the Khmer Rouge started decrying what they called the ideology of familyism. That people were too stuck on this bourgeois notion of the family, and so they were seeking to simply erase it. Now, it's important to note that this is not, in other instances, like in Vietnam, there was not an effort to try to disrupt the family as transitioning into a communist society. This was a particular Khmer Rouge creation which had very drastic consequences, particularly because divorced from their families, facing the threats of death, killing fields, facing accusations coming from different parties of who is letting down the workforce, who is skimming off the top of the rice quota. All of these factors lead to famine, lead to death, and lead to a disruption of family life. So families talk about in the various testimonies we looked at, the harm done to them when they could no longer meet with their family over a meal, or their loss of connection to the spirits in the spiritual world. Or the forced marriages is a difficult term because there's always been a tradition of arranged marriage amongst many Cambodians. But the Khmer Rouge version of the marriage, which brought people who often didn't know each other at all, and no longer was marriage a way of connecting families together where they might share, cooperate within their work, within the village. Instead, families were brought together under Angkar, under the Khmer Rouge, in order to reproduce before the population growth needed to preserve the revolution. Okay. So we have a radical disruption of family life that you hear about frequently in the testimony about the ways in which childhoods, families were severely disrupted to the point where people lost recipes. They could no longer knew how to cook, like over this short 4 to 5 year period, no longer cook family meals. Traditional songs from regions had to be recovered after the genocide. Okay, so I've got about 4 minutes, so I'm going to just quickly summarize Mount Ararat, which is also a very complicated story. But Mount Ararat does not have an exclusive relationship with Armenians. I want to make clear that Mount Ararat has relationships with multiple peoples who have lived within this area through which many different groups have traveled. But certainly in Armenian iconography and in Armenian culture, Mount Ararat is prominent. It is part of an Armenian tradition of seeing mountains as living entities, often seeing them as personified as giants, sisters, brothers, bulls, dragons. But most importantly, Mount Ararat has often been presented as the mother of Armenia and as sort of the key to Armenian ethnic identity. So with much of the diaspora from the Armenian genocide, people who've gone elsewhere, what you will see on many family homes, is that picture of Mount Ararat on the wall. It's actually quite joked about quite frequently by Armenian friends of mine who talk about like some of the terrible Ararat paintings that you would see in some homes. But it is a point of connection that people keep to their Armenian identity, in part because, I mean, Ararat communicates this sort of permanent presence of the Armenian nation, even when they are away, even when they are distant from Ararat. It is a loss because through the genocide, this territory where Ararat is located, which isn't too far from the current Turkish-Armenian border, was lost as part of that. The original treaty, Treaty of Sevres, after the end of World War I, and I can't say after the genocide because the effects of the genocide were still ongoing then, but it would have left Ararat as part of Armenian territory. But that lasted a very short period. A new treaty was defined because the Ottoman Turks refused to recognize the previous treaty, and Ararat was lost to Armenians. So you see Ararat on everything as you walk around a place like Yerevan. You see it on stamps, you see it on liquor bottles. Every presentation, every conference I went to has had a big picture of Ararat in the background. Real estate is more expensive if it faces onto Ararat. And key markers within the city, like the Genocide Memorial Museum, face onto Ararat. So you see the mountains. So it's a very key presence. So I don't have time to go over how this loss happened during the genocide, but I'll just summarize quickly that in the testimonies we reviewed, we saw how mountains marked the boundaries of the world for many Armenians. As they marched past mountains on their way to the Syrian desert, some saw the mountains as a source of strength and a sign of Armenian permanence on the land, while others felt an immediate loss as Ararat disappeared from the skyline on their travels. Through their murder and forced removal, they were stripped of their territory in a manner so that even their bones would not be left on the land, as many were left to starve in the desert. Sometimes bodies were thrown in the Tigris River so that they would sail out of it. It was an attempt to fully remove them, to deterritorialize them from connection to this land. So the last slide, and now you know these are the chapters I haven't finished on Rwanda, so you can see why I'm conveniently skipping over it. So my apologies to those of you studying Rwanda in the room. But I have to summarize very quickly because I'm out of time. My clock says 40 minutes. But one of the things we're looking at in relation to this project is what does this notion of genocide with nature mean for redress and justice in the aftermath of genocide? And it's not, it can be very difficult. I'll use Armenia as an example. Currently the Armenian government is seeking to normalize relationships with Azerbaijan, but most prominently with Turkey. It's been very difficult for people to cross through the Turkish border into Armenia. It's disrupted trade. It's had a lot of challenges. And part of that's been because of the Armenian insistence on genocide recognition, which Turkey refuses to recognize. But also Ararat is at the heart of this ongoing conflict. So the government has removed, for example, Mount Ararat as a passport stamp that one would get when one entered into Armenia. There would be a kind of a background visage of Ararat. So that's been removed as part of these negotiations to try to bring Armenian society out of this endless conflict. But for many Armenians, particularly in the diaspora, this has been a great violation, a betrayal on the part of the Armenian government to back off on any sense of claim to Ararat. But for negotiations with Turkish government, they see this as a territorial claim being made on them as a sovereign nation. So the continuing mention of Ararat by Armenians causes problems. And I don't think it's as simple as, this land belongs to Armenians or this land belongs to Turks. Ararat, continues to be a symbol, and also Kurdish groups have relationships with Ararat. Turks have relationships with Ararat. So it's a very problematic, difficult things to parse, and that's part of where, again, in this not yet finished project, we're going to be looking at some of these complications, but it's not going to be, I don't foresee an easy answer. So I'm going to leave it at that because I've gone over time, but thank you all for listening. I hope I didn't ramble too far off course.
Thank you, Andrew. Is that right?
You want to stay up here?
You can please stay there. Yes, we're gonna ask you a few questions, and so to do that, I'm going to invite people to raise their hands in the room, and/or to type their questions on the Q&A box online, which I'm watching, and/or to raise their hands. There's quite a few people online, and quite a few people that we know. So I invite questions from the room or questions online, and we'll go from there.
So thanks very much for the talk, Andrew. I'm super interested in this. I think there's something like really important about talking about how it is that relations with the non-human constitute groupness, and then how the transformation or destruction of those relationships affects the human groups that we're talking about. As you know, we've had some conversations about this, so there are some sort of prickly philosophical questions that I think are raised by introducing the idea of non-human relations as part of the constitution of cultures, and then proceeding from there to the moral questions about the destruction of those relations and what happens. So I'm going to give you like a slightly, what might seem like a kind of a ridiculous hypothetical here, and talk about oil as an aspect of the non-human. So our entire culture is formed in relation with the non-human entity of oil. And that's implicit and explicit. So a lot of that is invisible, but our practices are certainly saturated in oil. And were we to talk to somebody about the materials that underlie our culture, we would have to talk about oil. And if you go to Alberta and you talk to oil workers in that province, or you go to Texas or North Dakota or whatever, many of them will talk about their material relationship to oil, not just as an economic relationship, but actually as a cultural and historically important aspect of their identity as not just an individual, but as a group or a community. So in the demand to phase out fossil fuels, do we flirt with a form of, do we approach in any way, or is the specter of genocide raised in our demands that relationship be ruptured?
Right. Yeah, so couple thoughts here. I mean, part of this is the problem of the model we're using, where we're focusing on a single relationship, because I think with it does, even though we're using it to try to like illustrate a larger point about our multiple relations with the natural world, it can lead to examples like this. Well, there is a very primary symbiont, if we want to use that language, who in oil that is the foundation for cultures. But there would be a lot of other relationships with other natural world actors that would be jeopardized by that relationship. So part of that is the challenge of our design, I think. And for obvious reasons, for simplifying reasons, we've chosen this design, but I think that's one thing that gets lost. I also think on a moral angle, and I think about this in cultures all the way, like not all elements of cultures are good, and not all cultural relations are good. So this is where we need some sort of moral calculus about what is a group sustaining and a group vivifying relation, and what is a group harming one. And so, for example, like preserving patriarchy. Patriarchy is a very strong part of some of the cultures I've talked about today. And that's why I was doing my qualifying dance at the beginning to say, I don't want to preserve the family as it is in this set of power relationships that reproduce the capitalist system. But patriarchy, what benefit does it actually provide a cultural group? I think we've seen cultural groups try to exercise themselves of patriarchy, as difficult as that can be. And it's generally can be done very positively internally from within the group as a way of saying, okay, this is a form of relating to one another that's not been serving us well. We need to change it. And this is why it's important that we see groups as processes. I would like to think that our relationships with oil would also be one where we say, like, what does this sustain as if we take a long-term group view? What does this sustain, and what are the losses? And I think we could come to a moral argument by saying like, yeah, oil just doesn't cut it. And we may find actually with some of the examples I use, like, cattle in Rwanda is going to be very problematic on the small parcel of land. So how to sustain that relationship or it is going to be challenging under changing, because that's the other thing that cultures change in adaptation to ecological changes, and so these relationships also have to change. It's just sometimes about the speed at which they change and who's directing that change. Does that make sense?
It does. I have, of course, a million other questions, but I'll leave it at that. Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, great answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. There's a comment and question online, and then we'll maybe go back to the room. Just a first comment that I heartily concur from Dr. Adele Perry. She just compliments that this is important work, and she's glad you're doing it. I concur. Next question comes from Roy Oba, a master's student in peace and conflict studies. And Roy, if it's okay, I'm just going to read your question aloud. It's concise. You mentioned that Mount Ararat continues to serve as a symbol for multiple groups with overlapping claims and narratives. How do you think these layered meanings affect efforts toward reconciliation or shared heritage in the region?
Yeah, and that's a good question that I don't yet have an answer to, because I'm sort of still exploring that. But I mean, I think one benefit, I think, of thinking about the liveliness of and the vitality of more than human entities is that it makes it harder to objectify them and treat them simply as property belonging simply to one group, because a non-human entity can have relationships with more groups. And I think, coming out of the British Columbia context and studying, treaty negotiations there, one of the things I heard at treaty table was talk about shared territories, the ways in which, land claims often overlapped within the province, and Indigenous nations acknowledging that they were going to have to work out how to deal with these shared territories between Indigenous nations, but also with the municipal, provincial governments and federal governments. So I think, when you have a view towards multi-relationality, you can begin to think about, how this relationship can be preserved for multiple groups. It's something that can only come through negotiation between those groups, but hopefully having that relationship maybe even as a basis for peacemaking rather than as a source for conflict. But that's just presented in very general idealistic terms. I think to really dig down into that, I'm going to have to get more into this, the current politics between Armenia and Turkey right now.
Andrew, other questions in the room? Floor is open.
This is not directly related to your topic, but it is related to the subject of non-humans and genocide. Well, and I'm sure this was well known to people in the genocide community. I didn't know until the comments about Jane Goodall's work were at our forefront in terms of our attention. They were talking about, she studied two groups of chimpanzees, decided that they didn't like each other, and one of them succeeded in wiping the other tribe out or the other group out by killing the males, and then the females either left or became part of the conquering group. I have not had a chance to verify that yet. I would like to, but if that is a real thing, what would a genocide scholar say about that?
Wow. I mean, there's different approaches. For example, it reminds me of some of the debates that we have about pre-modern, for lack of a better word, ancient genocides. Did genocide happen before we had the modern instruments through which genocide is typically carried out? And modern instrument could mean anything from bureaucracy to the new technologies of warfare. And so warfare in the past could be brutal and could seek to preserve your group. You might eliminate the people who are perceived as a threat from the other group when you are in conflict. Whether that meets the standards of genocide in terms of there being some intentionality of it, some effort to destroy that group for who they are, is a question I think the more legalistically minded genocide scholars would have. But I think it's interesting just more in pushing genocide in a direction where it thinks a little bit more about the non-human for someone to actually look at that case and what it would mean. Because usually when we're trying to assess genocide, we're looking at what was the perpetrator thinking, what can we discern from their patterns of organization, their patterns of behavior, and none of us can speak on behalf of these populations, so it makes research very difficult. But I think at the same time, with work like Tasha Hubbard's work on bison genocide and indigenous understandings of animal groups as peoples, there could be inroads into trying to get at a difficult topic. Did I answer your question, or did I miss?
No, it's fine. My reaction to it was I was very depressed by that because it reduces any hope of trying to eliminate that behavior from primates and humans.
Yeah, we like to think we can, but recent events show us that genocide studies is in its own period of deep self-reflection on our inability to realize never again in practice.
Thank you, Andrew. I've got another question online, and maybe I'll put this one under the category of advice to PhD students seeking, but it's also a good question on its own. It's from Jesse Mattis, a PhD student in Peace Conflict Studies. He thanks you for the presentation. He loves the work. Could you speak to your experience of how interviewees reacted to you asking questions about their relationship to these non-human elements and its relation to genocide?
Yeah, so the interviews in our process were never about their experiences. And we mostly focus on interviews with experts or knowledge keepers who could give us a sense of whether our interpretations that we were taking from the transcripts were right or wrong. What I wanted to avoid with this project, because for each of these cases there is a healthy archive of oral histories from survivors, and I didn't want to have to go out into the field and ask people to talk again about their experiences in genocide. So our first test was to see if there was adequate information within these archives that would allow us to do the analysis we were anticipating, and that's where we found that in the transcripts people also actually do mention mountains a lot. They do mention cattle, they do mention water very frequently. So it allowed us not to go and do interviews that I felt were perhaps unnecessary. And then when we interviewed Elder Betty Ross, it was just mainly like, this is what we've read, this is what we've gained from this. Can you tell us, like, does this make sense from your understanding of a Cree, as a Cree person? So the interviews were almost fact-checking, or not fact-checking, but relationship checking.
So we've come up to the top of the hour, and so to keep within our time, we'll bring it to a close shortly for those that have to get to classes this afternoon. But just on behalf of the Moore Institute, Andrew, when we do these lectures, my favorites are the ones that just give you just tons of information and lots to think about, and you give us almost 3 lectures in one by looking at 3 different case studies. So the role of water in society, life-giving and life-denying, the means of productions to provide or divide, the role or symbol of a place, permanence. These are all things that come from these different case studies that you've shared with us, and I thank you for that. And we thank all of you for coming today to be at the lecture. Thank you, Andrew.